Our traditions define us. But our legacy impacts the world. We are first in Texas. We are Texas A&M.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, supporters, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. You can help us keep our essential reporting free for everyone to access by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jon Meacham and Peniel Joseph, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin.
I'm so happy to be discussing this wonderful new book with you. His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. And it's such a very interesting book, especially for the times that we're living in now. And the quote that I want to start off with is when you say here in your first, really the preface, overture, you say that John Robert Lewis embodied the traits of a saint in the classical Christian sense of the term. What do you mean by that?
I mean that he was devoted to a gospel vision of the world, rooted in the Beatitudes, which of course grew out of Leviticus, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which is one of the most radical propositions in human experience, because who wants to love their neighbor as themselves? You know, you want to love yourself more. Who wants to love your enemy? They're your enemy. But the imperative to find a way to reorder reality through acts of heart and mind and individual disposition has been at the core of the great moral traditions of the world. And what John Lewis did in the 20th century and into the 21st is he took that vision, he found a political expression for it, a civic expression for it, a battlefield on which to deploy that arsenal. And it was, again, an untraditional, non-traditional arsenal. We talk about Normandy rightly, we talk about Iwo Jima rightly. We don't think necessarily of Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma as battlefields, but they are in the same way, because different visions, competing visions of reality and liberty versus tyranny were in physical conflict in those hours. And what John Lewis did again and again and again is, because of his devotion to this prospect that in fact we had the capacity to love as opposed to hate and to fear, to love and to hope instead of to hate and to fear, and was willing to risk everything for it. That's what the Christian tradition saw as a precursor, as an essential element for sainthood. The capacity to sacrifice everything for a love of others. And that's what he did.
And when I read this book, I sense that you're reframing aspects of the civil rights movement's heroic period, because you really look at John Lewis, you look at the freedom rides, and you really even start talking about how a King and a Lewis, but also a Malcolm X, who we usually think of and is framed as somebody who's violent. You look at By Any Means Necessary and say, well, no, he's really challenging all of us to live up to the founding ideals and the founding principles, something I share. But talk to us about that in terms of how does John...
I read a book by this guy, this struggling academic in Texas about these issues. I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, yeah, it's you. Look, you've forgotten more about this question than I have, but I learned so much from you. The Sword and the Shield and the Black Power book. I think that you have been an important. I don't know if you've been a pioneer. I don't know if you would want that praise or not, but you have been an incredibly important voice in showing that the traditional kind of oversimplification of the elements within the movement of violence, of nonviolence versus the by any means necessary, is that these borders were in fact quite porous, and that Malcolm X obviously was on a kind of journey before he was murdered, and I think that even John Lewis himself, honestly, because of his pride and because he was hurt so by losing the chairmanship of SNCC to Stokely Carmichael in the spring of 1966, about 8 miles away from where I'm sitting at Kingston Springs, Tennessee. Even he sometimes saw the movement in this kind of Manichaean way. What you and important other scholars have done is help explain that, no, this was a complicated and ultimately illuminating conversation about the means of reform. A conversation that continues to shape us. I do think that one of the particular powers of John Lewis was his unwavering devotion to the nonviolent creed that he absorbed in the basement of the Clark United Methodist Church in Nashville, Tennessee, under James Lawson. Lewis never really questioned it. He questioned whether he was strong enough to continue. He questioned whether the country could, in fact, be redeemed at some level in his lowest moments, particularly after the assassinations and the bloodshed of the later 60s. But ultimately, and he and I debated this for almost 28 years, he believed that if you and I did the right thing, if our hearts and minds were in the right place, we could bring about the beloved community on earth. I don't think that. Barack Obama doesn't think that. Reinhold Niebuhr didn't think that. The American founders didn't think that. But John Lewis did. And you should listen to him, not to me, because he was willing to die for it.
And you say that, John, in the book, he was willing to die again and again and again for it. And you start the book, Selma, just recently, this right before his passing, and this arc of 1940 to 2020. I want you to talk about Lewis at the end, and then let's go back to Lewis at the beginning, because this great chapter, A Hard Life, A Serious Life. I love the title of the chapter. Gives us his beginnings. Troy, Alabama, son of sharecroppers who then get some land, just up until 1957. Talk to us about the 80-year-old Lewis, but then we'll go back to his humble beginnings.
Sure. The 80-year-old John Lewis got out of an SUV on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday in March, and was almost back to the weight he was in 1965. Pancreatic cancer was doing its worst. John had lost a lot of weight, and yet he had this, he had this remarkable capacity. He always seemed very quiet and shy until he started talking. And then he was just a fantastic preacher. And he did that on that Sunday. I was there with my family. There were probably 1,000 people there, maybe more. And I realized standing there that this was almost certainly his last visit, his last march there. And what I heard was a compelling sermon about we were on this bridge to shed a little blood to try to redeem the soul of America. And we kept pushing. And we've got to keep pushing. And it's interesting to me that the last image we have of him is not in Selma, is not telling the old story, but is at Black Lives Matter Plaza in front of the White House and Lafayette Square. And you know this as well or better than I do. John Lewis understood the power of the media. He understood imagery. He knew he needed to tell the story broadly. One of the secrets of the movement was that. And here's what he did. He goes, do you think it was somehow another coincidental that there was a photographer right there when he was standing at BLM Plaza in Washington? No. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he was connecting these struggles. He was connecting the crises of the moment with what can seem ancient. It can seem like Agincourt or Antietam, Selma and Montgomery, but they weren't distant for him because he was the battle-scarred veteran who had walked point. And I don't mean to glamorize it with the martial imagery, but I think one of the things I wanted to accomplish here, two things, was one is I want religious folks who profess the faith to realize what it's like to really practice it. And John Lewis really practiced it. And secondly, the movement should be seen as the kind of story we tell to understand not that everything's easy, but that despite the fact that everything's hard, there are these brave souls who lead us to a broader and better understanding of who we should be. And that's what John was doing in his 80s, and unto his death.
Yeah, and I think it's remarkable in terms of the Black Lives Matter and even the posthumous editorial that he left, and we'll talk about that at the end. Troy, Alabama. Take us back to Troy, Alabama. What was it like? How does that shape him?
Sure. February 21st, 1940, he's born. He's the great-grandson of a slave. So slavery for him was not an abstraction. He knew his great-grandfather. I think he lived until he was about 6 or 8. His parents, hardworking. They had jobs beyond the farm. 8 or 9 siblings, huge family. John was intrinsically curious. He had a kind of innate revulsion to the segregated order he encountered in Troy, in Pike County. One of the few white people he saw until he was into his teens was the mailman. When he read about the Brown decision in 54, he sat waiting for all his white friends to show up because he thought that this was a new era. He had, as George Bush might say, he had misunderestimated the authorities of Alabama. That's parenthetically an important thing. He was very much shaped by, I think, 3 tributaries, to torture the metaphor. 3 tributaries formed the river of John Lewis. One was this innate revulsion to the segregated order. And it really was innate. He saw it was wrong. He didn't have to be taught it was wrong. The second was the church. And I was interested, I didn't know this, in talking to him and doing this. Folks didn't go to, in segregated Alabama, at least in his part of it, folks didn't go to church every week because it was just too hard to get it all together because they worked so hard. So church was a twice a month thing, which I thought was interesting. So when you were there, it was really important and really consuming. And as John said, really long. One of the things, though, is that when he heard the gospel, he was skeptical of the let's wait till heaven comes. He said, I'm not interested in the streets of gold and of heaven being paved. I'm interested in the streets of Montgomery, the streets of Troy right now. And so that was the religious tributary is one, the innate revulsion is one. And then the other is the story of the emerging movement. And his parents couldn't afford a newspaper subscription. So his grandfather got the Montgomery Advertiser. That's where John Lewis would get it secondhand. He saw the pictures of Emmett Till, who was about the same age. He read about Autherine Lucy trying to integrate the University of Alabama in 56. When he came to Nashville as a seminary student, he read in the first fall he was here. He followed the Little Rock Nine in the local papers, and of course, most importantly, he heard Martin Luther King on the radio. John was convinced, this is a great, you'll appreciate this. This is a great biographical for the real dorks who are interested in these things. John Lewis was convinced that he heard Martin Luther King on the radio in 1955 preaching a sermon called Paul's Letter to the American Christians. King didn't give that sermon until 56. So in fact, John couldn't have heard it until 56. He continued until he died to tell me I was wrong. Now, if you're John Lewis, you can do that. That's fine. But you get into these things. In his mind, he heard King early on. I think what that means is that he knew about King. And of course, the first week of December 1955 is when the bus boycott starts. Troy, by the way, is about 45, 50 miles from Montgomery. And so Montgomery was the next big city. So these tributaries, the emerging movement, the voice of King on the radio, the stories about the folks in Montgomery, the fear of lynching, the fear of violence. He knew he could have been Emmett Till. He absolutely understood that. He told me he never had a physical fear of being harmed or lynched as a child or a young man, not until he was in police custody, which I thought was really interesting. And that innate revulsion against, the fact that he couldn't go to school with white folks. The white school was nice. The black school wasn't. He couldn't get a Coke when they went to the Five and Dime. And all these things, I'm going to throw this back to you. Do you worry about this? I worry sometimes. You have little kids. Mine are getting older all the time. I worry sometimes that the emphasis on the sit-ins and the freedom rides, that it somehow trivializes the stakes of the movement, what the symbolic things that were being fought for. It's like they think about lynch counters and they think, well, how important could that be? And I think it's so important to point out that the folks who were doing this brave work understood that that was a proxy. Ella Baker's great speech, remember, it's more than a hamburger.
More than a hamburger, absolutely.
Do you find with students, do you find that there's any sort of, I don't want to say dangerous, but a kind of distorting nostalgia about the early stories?
Yeah. No, absolutely. There can be a mismatch. The stakes are, I like how you talk about Agincourt and you talk about, the battlefield, because the stakes are much higher than just a sit-in, and that leads me, I want to discuss with you both Jim Lawson and Martin Luther King Jr. and the impact, because Lawson, it seems to me when we read your book, Nashville gives him the keys in terms of the keys to the kingdom, in terms of how do you practice nonviolence? How do you, and like you said, he's skeptical about his discipline to be able to do this. But eventually, as we know, he becomes John Lewis and he maintains that discipline. The freedom rides, the idea of soul force, chapter 3, let's talk about Lawson, that soul force that really turns him into John Lewis. The reason he becomes the youngest speaker at the March on Washington is because of what he learned in Nashville and because of what he did at the freedom rides.
Right. Well, he comes to Nashville because his mother found a brochure at an employer's house for American Baptist Theological Seminary. Still there. I'm actually teaching there this fall. 3 or 4 buildings on a beautiful hill, a hill on the other side of the Cumberland River, looking back at what was then segregated Nashville. About 100 students. They were all going to be preachers. It was owned by the white Southern Baptist Convention as part of a missionary, their view of what missionary work would be to train Black ministers. And Lewis shows up. It's James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette Jr., remarkable people, and starts going to church at the First Baptist Church on Capitol Hill here. And Kelly Miller Smith is the pastor. And Kelly Miller Smith is one of the figures who is trying to give Jim Lawson some recruits, really, some young souls to form. Lawson is a fascinating figure, as you know. If I were a better person, I would have written a book about Jim Lawson, because I think he's one of the most important Americans that not enough people know.
I agree.
Just very briefly, he's 91 years old, lives in Los Angeles now, delivered a marvelous sermon at John's funeral at Ebenezer, so everybody should go watch that. Lawson's the son of a Methodist minister. He becomes a Methodist minister, born, I think, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, is a conscientious objector during the Korean War, goes to jail during the Korean War. When he's released from jail for refusing to fight because of his pacifist conscience, he goes to India and meets, this is probably 8 years, correct, Peniel will know, after the Howard Thurman journey, Odyssey, right? Where Thurman and others encountered the Gandhi example, which I think was right after the war. Lawson was there with this Methodist background, but was learning the tactics of nonviolence and began to see that Gandhi offered a way forward, a way to implement this. He comes back, Lawson comes back to the United States, and as the story goes, he's at Oberlin on a visit, and so is a young guy named Martin Luther King Jr. And King realizes that he's talking to someone who had both been trained in the theology of the Black church and the tactics of Gandhi, and he says, "You're the kind of person we need in the South." And under the auspices of the Fellowship for Reconciliation, he comes to Nashville. He goes to Kelly Miller Smith, who's this great looking guy. Looks like if Denzel Washington had been a Black preacher, it would have been Kelly Miller Smith. Hugely charismatic, hugely important in the movement. Again, one of those stories that's not as well known. But he says to Jim Lawson, "John Lewis is ready." And I asked Lawson, when he told me that, I said, "What did Reverend Smith mean?" And he said that Lewis had, and this is the origin of what I was talking about the revulsion against segregation. John knew what he wanted to change. He had lived under this, my word, not Jim's, apartheid. And his sole force was searching for a way to marshal itself against that order. And nonviolence, informed by the gospel, was a path forward. And Lawson begins having these Tuesday night workshops. Diane Nash is there. John becomes a big recruiter for Lawson, actually. Poor Bernard Lafayette, who had something like 4 or 5 jobs, was just pounded on John Lewis and made to come. And so finally he comes and becomes a freedom rider, of course. It's just, the other thing to remember is they were so young, right? I mean, so John Lewis comes to Nashville when he's 17. He's not even 18 years old when he's a freshman at ABT. And he's 25, the grand old age of 25, when he's on the Pettus Bridge. So Nashville gave him, with the sit-ins, with Lawson, with Diane Nash, with Lafayette, with the people who really surrounded him, really the rest of his life, taught him these eternal principles and how to take those eternal principles and put them into action on the street.
Now, I want to fast forward a little bit with the time we have left in terms of, we know about the peak moments of the March on Washington, and really Selma, even though it's a brutal moment. What about, you talk about Black power, you have the chapter where it's called "This Country Don't Run on Love." And John was bitter about what happened with Stokely Carmichael. Stokely and him were friends. They had jailed together in Parchman Penitentiary. They were brothers and comrades in arms. That idea of SNCC as this circle of trust of sisters and brothers, right? Let's talk about that meeting in Kingston Springs, but also, what does John do? John is, when you see John being interviewed on Eyes on the Prize in the 1980s, he's very bitter about the Black Power movement. He's at that point a city councilor. He's on his way to being a congressperson, but he says Black Power is just empty slogans. I would push back against that, but what happens as the movement changes and transforms?
I think it was pretty much and again, fact check me on this. I'm embarrassed to talk about these issues with you. I learned most of what I know about it from your books. I think, look, nonviolence and the King-Lewis view was always controversial, right? Because it's so counterintuitive. And there were a lot of people. Diane Nash, I had a fascinating conversation with her about this, because I said, nonviolence, now that we see that it worked in many ways, it seems noble, but at the time it was just frustrating, right? Which is part of what goes to your question. And she said it was a very practical decision. We couldn't take up arms against an entire nation. We would have lost. And so there's a moral dimension, but there's also this very pragmatic argument that there was no way to change a mighty nation without appealing to conscience, because an appeal to arms would have failed. So I think that's again, that's Ms. Nash talking, not me. I thought that was a really interesting point. I think by 1966, just reading the record of this and talking to Lewis about it, Lewis was seen, interestingly. So in 1963, he's seen as overly radical, and the Kennedy administration and the Archbishop of Washington, and they all want to change his speech because it's so incendiary. You read it now and you think, you don't see the flames, right? But within 3 years, there's a woman in SNCC who's quoted as saying in a Claiborne Carson book that every time Lyndon Johnson or Martin Luther King called, John would be sending his suit to the cleaners and getting on a plane. And he was seen as too close to power. And this is after Atlantic City, after the failure to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And I think that John Lewis became the at-hand embodiment of the limitations and the elongated timetable for the kinds of progress that people understandably and urgently wanted. And I think that, if anything, history vindicates everybody, right? Because again, you fact check me on this. It's very much the spirit of Stokely Carmichael that's, it seems to me, to be abroad in the country right now. The urgency. Mm-hmm. John spoke with an urgency. Dr. Mm-hmm. King spoke with an urgency, but it was a measured urgency, mm-hmm. right? Wasn't part of Carmichael's charismatic effect that it wasn't measured, right? It was an appeal to, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this Black Lives Matter moment really vindicates all of them. Those folks who were nonviolent, fierce urgency of now, but also the Black Power activists who said there were structural problems that were so deep, we needed fundamental change and transformation. And, with that, as we close, John, I want to talk to you about the power of hope in this year of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter year. And really, Congressman Lewis, who you knew, I had a chance to meet too, but he wrote posthumously, they published this wonderful op-ed in the New York Times where he talked to us and he called us to hope and to citizenship and our highest ideals as a country. And I want to just end on that note. What did you make of that op-ed? And to me, that op-ed was just so John Lewis. It was brilliant and had the whole country and the whole world talking about it the next day.
It did. What John would say when people came to him, understandably, and said, things aren't changing fast enough. You know, the beloved community is not here. There is still this injustice. There is still so much work to be done. He would say, if you don't think America can change, come walk in my shoes. And here's a man, again, his great-grandfather is a slave. He's born in a segregated state, and he dies mourned by millions and eulogized by presidents. And I don't mean to elevate him just because of the temporal nature of that. You know, how he died does not really, it speaks to how he lived. But the lesson of his life is more important than the lesson of his death. And the lesson of his life is a urgent moral sensibility to A, love your neighbor, B, love your enemy, and C, and it's in that piece, it's in the afterword he wrote for this book, if you see something wrong, say something. Just and there's something so liberating about the capacity to speak truth, speak it fearlessly, and to use an image from his friend Robert Kennedy, that creates a ripple. And one of the ripples of hope is that moral consciousness is a mosaic. And that the great thing about a republic, and John believed this fundamentally, is if you and I can get on the right side of things, that's two more folks on the right side. And if we can get more people, then we find our way to that beloved community.
Well, thank you so much, John. This book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. I want everybody to see this. This is an extraordinary book, John. It adds to your long list of just beautifully written narrative nonfiction histories, and I implore everybody to read this. And it's been great having this conversation with you.
Well, thank you, and everybody should know Peniel was incredibly helpful to me when I was doing this. Read The Sword and the Shield. Read all the Joseph Cannon. It's coming soon to Netflix. But I'm grateful to you. Thank you.